Greetings and welcome to the International Pediatric Simulation Society podcast. This show is for people passionate about pediatric simulation-based education, training, and research. Podcast hosts are members of IPSS, a global community of multidisciplinary healthcare professionals from over 30 countries, all dedicated to improving the care of infants and children worldwide. Each week, one of our sub-hosts, Christine Bailey, Elaine Ng, Erin Carn-Bennett, and myself, Samreen Vora, will introduce you to a new guest and bring you into a conversation with simulationists and healthcare professionals from across the world. Come along. Today we are going to be talking with Nichola Concannon from Sydney Children's Hospital. I'm Erin Carn-Bennett and I've had the pleasure of working and teaching alongside Nichola in simulation for probably as long as I've worked in simulation really, so since 2019. So welcome along, Nichola. It's lovely to have you here with us today. And we're going to be talking about psychological safety. But first off, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself, Nichola?
Thanks very much for that intro, Erin. So I'm a pediatric emergency physician, but also I've trained in general pediatrics. And as you can tell from my accent, I came from Ireland to Sydney in 2003, initially on a one-year visa. And 10 visas later, and more than 20 years later, I've clearly ended up staying. Currently, I work half-time in that role in paediatric emergency at Sydney Kids, but I also work 12 hours a week as the medical co-lead for simulation in our hospital. If I think about simulation and how I came to it, initially I was exposed as a junior doctor in the emergency department, where I was given the opportunity to attend a simulation course as a candidate as part of a multidisciplinary team. And that was at the Sydney Clinical Skills and Simulation Centre in North Shore, which is another hospital across town in Sydney. And that was back in, I looked at it, 2011, but I remember instantly being hooked because I think the reason it had such a profound influence on me, it was the first time I was part of a debrief with a multidisciplinary team. And I definitely could see the value of hearing the perspectives, particularly of my nursing colleagues, which I'd not heard in that way before. After that, I got the opportunity to do the Harvard faculty course when Dan Raymer and Robert Simon came to Sydney to the Blacktown Centre, which was a brand new centre at the time. Following on from that, Ella Scott, that many people might know, was the co-lead of simulation in the other hospital in Sydney, which was the other children's hospital with Rena Festa. And she helped me fumble my way through debriefing, and I'm still learning to this day. So each year, Ella would send our team an invite to the International Pediatric Society conference. And I recall going to New York one of those very early years with my co-worker, Jane, who's my nurse co-lead now, and being really impressed by the quality of the workshops. And we had such a fun time with that group. So that was kind of what fostered my interest in simulation. And I think IPSS has really opened so many doors for me professionally, but it's been also one of the great ways to start friendships and to network. Of course, that's how we've come to get to have such great bonds with you in Auckland.
I think the ties that we have with you between the Douglas Starship Simulation Programme and Sydney Children's is a really special bond and tie to one another and a lovely connection. And it's lovely for us to be able to teach alongside each other and to also catch up. And, you know, we do our down under dinners at IPSSW and things, which is always fun. I hear you and I want to reinforce that, you know, I'm still learning to debrief as well. I don't think we're ever done with debriefing and learning, right? There's always more. It's like the more you get into it, the more there is to know, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Actually, Erin, when you just made me think, I think one of the things about IPSS is they really make new members in particular feel really welcome and included.
Yeah.
And I really look forward to those yearly catch-ups with our colleagues and the Tasman margarita nights that we share.
Yeah.
It's a great way of bonding the community because we don't get the chance to see each other that often and we're so far away, often are traveling for different conferences. And it's one great way. I've definitely made some great friends. I have a friend, Ethel Ryan, in Ireland, as you know. I often meet up with her. The workshop always gives us, at IPSS, always give us lots of ideas for new projects because out of that, that's where we had that collaborative, the after clinical event workshop that we did. And without without IPSS, we wouldn't really have been able to branch out into research with the suspense study with you, where we've collaborated, and the Inspire Network, those kind of things that have really fostered some of the areas that we traditionally were weaker on in our simulation program. The scenario library is definitely a godsend. All that work that Trish and everybody has put into those in COVID times, we definitely shared so many resources and got so much support from more established units. And if I think back all the times you have shared resources with us and onboarding team members and writing proposals for sim fellowships and financial reports, never mind being just a fabulous excuse to visit really interesting countries and experience different cultures. I think of my last trip to Lisbon, where I bumped into you on the street and met my parents and shared a hotel room. Where would you ever get the chance to do that? So it's been such a great opportunity. And I think of those roaming trips around Amsterdam with Mike Shepherd after the conferences. It's such great fun and great team bonding, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think that power of community is such a huge part of IPSS, isn't it? It's actually quite a small international community of us that do pediatric simulation. And we're all facing the same or similar challenges or have things that we're trying to break ground into. So everyone is just so giving and so wonderful. And it is such a cool society to be a part of, no matter where you are in the world, really. And it is such a special community and collaborative approach and sharing approach and helping one another. It's awesome. That's covered a lot of the recommendations of joining IPSS and how it's been beneficial and things. Was there anything else you wanted to add before we moved on, Nichola?
I don't think so. I just laugh. Jane, my nurse colleague, and myself, we've joked sometimes that we see more of each other in our IPSS escapades than we do of our partners sometimes.
Right.
It's such a great time away. We really look forward to those little jaunts away with our team members.
It's so re-energizing as well, isn't it? You come home with so many ideas of things. I think that's probably the biggest part for me, is just how inspiring it is being around all these amazing humans that are doing such cool stuff. Anyway, I guess we should move on, but that was fun. So the theme of today is psychological safety. Can you think of some examples you could share with us, Nichola, around psychological safety, maybe when it was done well and maybe when it wasn't done so well from your experiences in simulation?
Yeah, sure. I think psychological safety is something I'm very passionate about. I think it's something that is really empowering when it's done well. Some of our toughest customers that we have on our courses in Sydney, there's a course I can think of that we ran for pediatricians who come to a conference called the Course in Pediatrics, where they'd asked us to develop some simulation sessions for them. I can think of one of those courses where we were running a pediatric patient scenario, and one of the clinicians had nominated himself as an event manager. And this group are a very diverse group of pediatricians from all over Australia and New Zealand and interstate. And when we were in the debrief, one of the turning points I remember, because these were very experienced clinicians, I remember when we started to normalize making mistakes, it really was palpable, the change in tone and in openness and sharing of experiences. And in the course of that, actually, one of those pediatricians, the person who had nominated himself as the event manager, I remember it was really powerful. He admitted that he actually had signed himself up to the course with a fear of simulation, but having been out of the workforce for 6 months after having a life-threatening illness.
Wow.
And in a way, he was doing it as cognitive behavioral therapy to try and make sure that when a resuscitation happened, that he would be able to do that. And it was just really powerful how he said, he was one of our most powerful advocates later, saying, as an older clinician, I really admired the way he embraced simulation and he engaged with it. But it made total sense, and it was so powerful hearing him talk through how this physical event in his life had really made him fearful of approaching that pediatric resuscitation, but hearing others support him and sharing their stories about the strategies and solutions they had for when they'd come across similar events, it was very empowering. And I remember thinking, wow, clearly he felt safe in sharing that information, and that was very personal information, but it was probably one of the most powerful debriefs, although it was one of the ones I really was so fearful of approaching. And it made me think about all of those debriefing techniques that we have, how if you just trust the process, that it will evolve naturally when it is just an actual conversation.
The more that I'm getting involved in designing courses and things like that, I'm finding the same, just how much power there is in psychological safety and creating this safe container for people to share their stories like that, because that is so powerful. And that's the stuff that you remember umpteen years later. That's the way that we change clinical practice and we change people's perspectives and things. And yeah, I think there is just so much to be said about storytelling.
It was such an interesting group, actually, I remember, because thinking about the design, when you talk about how you think about how you might design, we involved all of those pediatricians in making, it was almost like a bespoke program for them, because it was pretty high stakes. They were there without their teams, but yet still trying to making it a meaningful experience for them. And I remember just hearing some of the pediatricians, some of the comments they made at the time. We had a pediatrician at the end of their career talking about how they worried about cognitive decline and how do they keep their skills up. And then we had some younger pediatricians in that group who were really starting out their career, who wanted to have the minds of the older pediatricians worry that they didn't have enough knowledge. It was just so interesting seeing both ends of the spectrum and seeing that group share and support each other during that session. It was definitely one of the most memorable debriefs I can think of.
I think the cognitive decline is definitely a real thing. Like, even I can relate to that. I've talked about it before on our podcast about returning from maternity leave and you just feel like your brain's on another planet. It's a lot, eh? And it's something that people grapple with at all stages of their career. It's for sure a thing.
Yep.
Yeah. Have you got any, did you have an example of one where it wasn't done well that you felt was appropriate to share? Or
the example that came to mind actually where it wasn't done well was when I was at an emergency conference, not at IPS, I should say, as a disclaimer. And it was many years ago now. So in fairness, I think we've learned a lot about psychological safety since then. But it's a great example in that I've probably reflected on this a lot and learnt so much more from it. But it was a conference where there was gamification of sim. So there were some sim wars with two teams pitted against each other to win the simulation war. And when we were attending the session, we weren't sure how this was going to evolve, but basically participants were not given a choice to participate. They were selected from the audience on the spot as they arrived to the conference session and escorted from their chairs to the stage at the front of the chair and given T-shirts to wear in different teams.
Oh my.
They were announced team members allocated to one of two teams and thrown straight away into a simulation about a rapidly deteriorating pediatric patient. And the observers were the larger international audience. So it became quite obvious as it evolved that some members of one of the teams spoke English as a second language. And at the end of the session, the audience, you could see, were also feeling uncomfortable, and they were uncomfortable in front of the large audience. And I just remembered that when the debrief had finished, those two quiet female participants exited very rapidly from the hall. And I think that just left us with a feeling of the tension, I suppose, and sadness was palpable. And I've definitely reflected on that experience and thought long and hard about how not to do that. But like I said, it was many years ago now, but it's clearly still, you can probably hear, ingrained in my brain about the different aspects of that perhaps could have been done differently.
I think there's definitely things that happen like that, that you constantly reflect as an educator. You do things and you've got good intentions, and then it's afterwards that you go, oh man, that was not good. Like, we shouldn't have done that. I think we've all got some cringeworthy things that we've done over the years, but it's all about owning your mistakes, apologising where necessary and growing and learning.
Yes, exactly.
Psychological safety is one of these things that it's everywhere, right? It's a buzzword almost in any industry, really. Everyone's talking about it, especially post-COVID and things, and it means different things to different people. So what does it mean to you, Nichola?
That's a really good question and hard to put a simple answer. But
Yeah.
for me, it's complex, but yet it's simple. And for me, it's that thing that vulnerability is attached to it.
Yeah.
I often think I have the little Peter Weinstock and Trish Wood in my ear, saying, really loving the learner and holding that person in high regard and having the utmost of respect for them and really prioritizing that safe learning environment. And really, I think some of the things I think about are, it's one thing to say that you hope that you create a safe environment. It's a very different thing if your learners feel that. I think it's understanding and role modeling it from the very minute that you get the email asking an inquiry about a course, acknowledging that email, even if you can't answer it straight away, really from the very minute you engage with your learner, that really sets the tone for psychological safety. Really, I suppose as I've become, because as I mentioned to you, I'm also an emergency physician and I have some learners that I'm actually a supervisor for. So I'll often have this dual role. So I make it really clear when I'm in my simulation role to those trainees that may be in my learner group. If I'm doing a team training zone 3, as we would call it, type simulation, I make it really transparent and clear that there won't be any negative professional implications as a result of taking part in a simulation with me, because I would want someone to hold that respect for me. And I've often been in that situation where I've been a learner, and I feel really passionate about that. And really, occasionally we've been asked to comment on someone's performance in simulation, and I think we've been very strong in our program in shutting that conversation down and explaining to people why that wouldn't be safe to comment on that. Because I think information like that leaks out, and then that would really affect the psychological safety of your program. So we're very passionate about that. And really what we want to do is to make people feel more comfortable in risk-taking and feeling safe to do that, to embrace feeling uncomfortable, a bit like what Jenny Rudolph says, feeling safe enough to embrace feeling uncomfortable during that learning that they're doing.
Being brave enough to suck at something new, right?
Yes, and I think that's something we almost have taken as part of our new line and of our pre-brief, or it's something definitely I've taken on board. That whole thing of celebrating the mistakes, or let's make mistakes together. And seeing that as a learning opportunity and not as the threat. Trying to reframe that whole, shift that whole psychological thought of learning comes from some of those mistakes.
Yeah, I totally agree. That whole failing fast and fixing methodology, we need to be, it's almost like there's kind of this movement of celebrating mistakes and errors, especially in environments like simulations, so we can fix them. It for sure relates back into psychological safety. So we've been lucky enough to teach alongside one another on our 3-day faculty development workshops a number of times. I guess part of the reason I've invited you on the podcast, Nichola, is because I feel that you do psychological safety really well for participants. So can you tell us a little bit about how you do that?
I suppose, Erin, it starts from a simple person being an emergency physician. So I think of it in things that you do before you even start the simulation. So I mentioned a little bit about that email that comes through asking about a course, so I think about some things I do beforehand. There are some things I do during the simulation, and then some reactive strategies that I have as well if it becomes obvious, for example, in the debrief that things are not go so well. If I was to think about the things beforehand, I suppose it's depending on the type of simulation we're running, whether it's a 1-hour session or a 4-hour or a full day session, in the structure and design of our curriculum. Thinking about how we might do welcomes and introductions, And if someone's mentioned a little fact or a fun fact about themselves, I always try and weave that some way into further on in the course, because I really think that helps you think about them as an individual, not just another number, and really feel like they belong and that they're included and that you've listened to them and that you've heard them. So I think there are little ways or little tricks that might be just something small that you might do to try and weave it into your debrief or later on in the day. I think when we get new fellows, what we often do is get them to do a little bit of learning and reading around psychological safety. And that Jenny Rudolph article is really great, the safe container that you've referred to before. There's some really nice podcasts, the Simulcast group with Vic Brazel have some really nice sessions on psychological safety. But we get new faculty to write their own pre-brief. So a pre-brief might be part of psychological safety and have some kind of cognitive aid to help them. And I always use my cognitive aid to try and remind myself and keep myself on track. But I think really psychological safety is not just about the pre-brief. I suppose that's what I'm getting at. There's so many other components of that. And I think many of those things are, the ground rules of engagement, letting teams, particularly if it's a new environment, and you would know that because you often will mock up some environments that are not even clinical spaces, so letting, and I've seen you do some incredible things in your library. Does the call button work? Are we putting out a true whatever code call or whatever it is? Can we use safe medications? Is our defibrillator live? Spending some time on the confidentiality contract. As I mentioned, it goes beyond the simulation session. If you're asked afterwards, you have to walk the walk and role model it. If you're asked about someone's performance, shutting down that conversation on the corridor, or it may be somebody well-intentioned in the tea room who really saw something really great, but actually giving your learners permission to say, hey, you know what, we had entered into an agreement and said that we wouldn't talk about that outside of the performance. So empowering the learners to be able to do that if they do see a breach of that confidentiality. Thinking about the location of where we're going to debrief. So sometimes on the corridors it may not be so safe, or in the bed space next to the patient that's being dealt with in real life afterwards. We really consider about how we might transition from a simulation session to a debrief phase, if that's the type of simulation that we're doing, and how we might keep our learners safe throughout that experience, thinking about how they might respond to some codes. And that fiction contract, talking about this is the ground rules and the expectation. It's a gift to your colleagues to engage. The more you engage, the more we will learn from this. I think I mentioned before, I'm always very cognizant in my dual role in declaring if there's a conflict of interest, that if I'm supervising somebody, going out of my way and being very transparent, that there won't be professional ramifications for them or performance ramifications for them in their end of term report. And I think really that basic assumption, stating it if that's appropriate to the zone or the type of simulation that you're doing. Thinking about that 95% rule, I think I often think of a debrief as the extension of the pre-brief in a way, and being transparent about what the objectives are, what form it's going to take, how long it will be, and outlining that process to my adult learner. I think that makes them feel safe. And if there might be I'm not afraid to use a cognitive aid. Like I said, I've been doing this for a while. I'll always have my card, which is appropriate to the type of simulation activity I'm doing. Having that card around keeps me to task and keeps me structured. And also if I'm co-debriefing with a colleague, it's important for us to be on the same page, and then it's obvious to them about where we are in the phase of the debrief, if it's during the debrief.
It's like a little security blanket, isn't it, that card?
Exactly. And in terms of being psychologically safe, one of the things I've seen really role modeled really well and I'm reminded of is thinking about your faculty on your debrief and the composition of that if we're doing that. So making sure we have diversity and inclusion. So I'm thinking in particular of last week we just did another a course with our pediatrician friends who attend a child protection course, where I will be debriefing with often a social worker because they're such an integral part of their team. It's one of the courses I love the most because I know nothing about child protection, and I find it really easy to be genuinely curious in asking my questions because it's outside of my area of expertise. But it's that thing for our learners of not making it look uncomfortable. I have to pre-brief the social worker, and we use the same structure as we would use in our learning conversations beforehand, work out what sections of the cards or of our debriefing card we're going to do. And whenever we might come to a part that we're not sure about how to proceed, we'll have above table conversations about, have I left anything out? Increasingly, I think that makes your learners feel comfortable, saying this is our first time doing this together, bear with us. There might be a bit of toing and froing. We're learning to get used to each other. And I think that makes your learners at ease and feeling
definitely.
safe.
To be clear is to be kind, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm like, are you ever an expert in simulation? I'm not sure. It's like it's a lifelong learning journey, isn't it? And there's nothing wrong with owning that, right?
Exactly. But it's fun when you feel like you've done a nice job and you get the feedback. It's really spurs you on to try and want to do better the next time as well.
Yeah, definitely. So both Douglas Starship Simulation Programme and Sydney Children's, we're framed very much around our curriculum as the SimZones method, which was created by Dr. Peter Weinstock and Chris Roussin. How do you find that helpful for psychological safety using the SimZones?
I think it's particularly helpful in speaking the same language when I'm talking to, for example, other simulation programs about sharing that mental model about who the learners are, what their level of expertise is, and what debriefing tactic we might choose for that particular session.
Yeah, I think that's it. We had Peter on our podcast last year, and we grilled him about the SimZones and asked him where it came from, and he was talking about the same language thing, and he was sort of talking about how otherwise it becomes a bit of a simulation fruit salad. He referenced going into the OR with a group of people and saying you're going to do surgery. That's a pretty broad term. What does that mean? The same as if you say we're going to do simulation today. Whereas if you're more specific and that you're in zone 3 or that you're doing an appendectomy, people understand what you mean and are more intentional in what they're able to do because of speaking the same language.
It's interesting you say that, Erin, because I think increasingly as we've been collaborating with our counterparts in Victoria, and we recently had Peter over and had our first online group of simulation personnel from all states in Australia, which was the first time we've managed to get us all online. It really became really clear to us that we had to be very intentional about sharing that mental model. If I say to you zone 3 type simulations, we have that shared mental model of what that would look like, what the debriefing technique would be like, what environment we would be doing that. And when we ran our most recent course, it became very obvious to us because in Australia, many people have trained with many different methodologies. Even within our own institution, there are many different structures that people use in debriefing. So it becomes even more important to speak the same language. And I just find you can get to the point really concisely without lots of words. It's a simple way of sharing that mental model. And I find that even with some of my European counterparts, when I'm talking to my friends in Ireland who are delivering simulation, SimZones has become a thing there. I loved in New Zealand that some of your learners know they're signing up to a Zone 2 course. They instantly know what they're signing up to and what that's going to look like. We're starting to see that here, but we haven't. Because of the diversity of different tools and different programs, we're only starting to see that start at grassroots here, but it definitely does help.
That speaking the same language is interesting, right? And I mean, the SimZones is one way of doing things.
Exactly.
And it's not that any one way is more superior than others, but it's that same language piece is for sure a thing. We have the same thing here where we will debrief with groups of people who are trained in many different methods. But if you go in and you have had this conversation around what the debrief is going to be like and what the plan is, and are we on the same page here, and what methodology are we using and things. It just sort of brings everyone together as well before you begin. Afterwards, you can sometimes not be resentful, but be a bit like, that went on a real tangent there and I wasn't really sure what was going on with my co-debriefer. And it's if they haven't done things for a while or they're trained in a different methodology, but you haven't had that pre-meeting as a faculty to decide what you're doing, it does end up impacting your psychological safety, because that also can confuse your participants too, right?
Exactly.
If the people at the top aren't really sure what they're doing, nobody really knows what they're doing. But I think we'll just round off this conversation because we've covered a lot of ground here. It's been great. Thanks, Nichola. But so how do you deal with when things don't go as planned in debrief? What's some strategies that you sort of put into motion?
It's a really good question, Erin. I think over time, one of the things I've learnt is to trust my gut instinct. If I'm sensing that things are not going so well, it's almost like when you're an event manager, actually verbalizing that rather than trying to plow on and increasingly seeing some of our learners try to save each other or rescue the situation, so it's learning that fine art of learning to intervene and steer the conversation. Time and time again, have gone back to Adam Cheng's toolbox for difficult debriefing strategies because I find it so useful, where he talks about naming the dynamic. So if I'm sensing tension between two groups, and often I find it's maybe some of those Zone 3 team-based trainings where there are different tribes that we're bringing together. There may be some underlying social friction that has been there simmering in the background that you may not be privy to, but actually saying out loud, I'm sensing some tension here.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, trying to shift it towards patient-centered care if it's around a patient simulation. I'm wondering, taking it outside of this particular simulation today, if we had the same situation again, how might we best proceed and deliver the best possible care to this patient? Trying to take the heat off the moment and bring it outside and hearing the expertise outside. Even sometimes, occasionally, despite your best intentions and setting things up well, sometimes a candidate learner might be triggered by a simulated event, but often those ones can lead to the richest discussion. I'm thinking of a recent one. It comes back to what you were saying there previously, Erin, about returning from maternity leave. We had one of our anaesthetists actually become frozen. It was really interesting the discussion that led to afterwards, because it's been a situation that others could identify with. The support that came from the group and the rich discussion that ensued afterwards was really beneficial to all. And I think we all learned, as a facilitator, I learned as well, some strategies. So acknowledging it, I think, and having the guts to acknowledge it when you feel that things are not going so well in a debrief. I think role modeling, just those general things we talked about, which were empathy, being kindness and caring and gentle. In that situation I described previously, that anaesthetist, when they had mentioned that they froze, they actually became very teary. We did stop the debrief and acknowledge that and gave them some control over, did they want to speak about it, using some silence and allowing some time for them to process. We asked, did they want to continue, or would they like to take a break? And it's really interesting. That's only happened a few times in my life, but it's really interesting. Most people choose, they actually do want to talk about it. And I think at the end, whenever, as I would always do when you wrap things up, I would remind people at the end of the debrief about confidentiality, really thanking, for example, that individual, the anaesthetist, thanking them for being so vulnerable. And also I find, particularly if I'm doing something with my own group of emergency group, really thanking those from outside of my department, because I think it's very hard for them to come into our department when we're such a tight-knit group. So acknowledging those from outside, maybe your base group. When I'm down in theatres, we might do the same thing with ward people who have to respond to theatre events. So acknowledging that there are different challenges for those group who are interacting with a base team, and really thanking them for their contribution. So we're making these small little deposits in our emotional bank, I suppose, so that hoping over time will build up cultural change and safety. And that's the things that we try and do over time.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you so much, Nichola. It's been a lovely conversation with you today about psychological safety.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the IPSS Podcast. A special thanks to our behind-the-scenes producer, the talented Danish Kumar, and to the Starship Foundation for providing the equipment that makes this podcast possible. Join us next time.